And then another criticism would have been about bullying,
Yeah.
something that I think you feel sort of personally aggrieved about there. But do you, looking back, think, did I treat my House of Commons staff well? Or do you think there were times, because you have a great command of the English language, where you overly harsh with members of Parliament in the House when you would take them to task or rebuke them? Do you ever look back at that and say there was cause for people to think there was bullying there?
I certainly don't think there was cause for people to think there was bullying. Let me separate those two issues, Esther, because they're important, but they need to be treated as distinct entities on their own. As far as the handling of colleagues is concerned, I think most of the time it was fine. People were pretty good-natured. But I would, on reflection, say that I sometimes mishandled individual situations. On one occasion, for example, I was rude to Greg Hands quite late at night. I think I had probably almost masochistically, but I enjoyed it, stayed in the chair for hours and hours and hours and hours in those Brexit debates. And he heckled something and I was irritated and I rounded on him and was rude to him, and I shouldn't have been, and I apologised to him in the chamber the following day. And I think there were other occasions when I was unduly irascible and waspish. I can think of one example of a new member who outraged me by asking a question, and while the exchanges on that question were ongoing, that as soon as he'd finished, he beetled out of the chamber. And I thought, this is an extraordinary way to behave, and it's in total contravention of the conventions of the House. Now, Esther, in retrospect, what should I have done? I tried to get him to come back in the chamber, and he did, but I should just have asked him to come up to the chair, and I should gently, or not gently, as the case may be, but I should have said to him, don't do that. It is a considerable parliamentary discourtesy. He was a new member. I didn't. He came back in the chamber and I said, well, very good, or words to that effect, of the honourable gentleman to return to the chamber. Well, I'm glad he has, but it was quite extraordinary for the honourable gentleman to ask a question and then immediately beetle out. In total violation of the conventions of this House. I can't understand what motivated him. So in other words, I sort of tore him off a strip in a way that wasn't wise or necessary. Now, I'm told by a friend of mine who is a mutual friend of this chap and of mine that he doesn't bear a grudge, but at the time he was probably quite irritated. I remember Charles Walker once telling me Sajid Javid was upset when I laid into him one day about the handling of a government statement. I thought he'd mishandled the whole thing. The House hadn't been given the documentation in advance. The House was treated with considerable discourtesy, but I literally trod on him and said, well, extraordinary behaviour by the Secretary of State. It's quite unacceptable to me and to the House. And he apparently went off feeling, this high and feeling somewhat aggrieved. So I think I sometimes did mishandle those situations, but I think I could point to a very large number that I handled with humour. I think a lot of people would say that members of Parliament ought to be, frankly, a bit robust. And quite a lot of colleagues are very good at dishing it out, but they don't like taking it. I would also point out that I never threw a Conservative member out of the chamber. I threw out 3 opposition members over 10 years, in every case for accusations against other members of dishonesty, i.e. they impugned the integrity of another member. And so I asked Nigel Dodds, Paul Flynn and Dennis Skinner on separate occasions to leave the chamber. I never asked a Conservative member to leave the chamber. So, yes, I sometimes got it wrong, but, was there bullying there? I don't think there was bullying there at all. As far as staff is concerned, all I can say, as far as staff are concerned, all I would say is I got on incredibly well with the vast majority of people with whom I worked. Very large numbers of people I worked with over a very long period who stayed with me for a long time. There were people in the Speaker's office who were with me on day 1 and on my final day. People who worked for me, if not for the whole 10 years, for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, etc. There were 3 people who, well, actually 4 people who brought complaints against me. One of them was investigated and thrown out. The others were upheld. Esther, I was accused of ghosting someone on an aeroplane from London to Nairobi in September 2010. The person concerned was sitting some rows behind me. The investigator thought this a most significant matter, that I had blanked this person for several hours. As I patiently and politely explained, it was a night flight. I was en route to making a speech at a conference in front of 400 people the following morning. And, hey presto, surprise, surprise, I went to sleep. I don't call that bullying. I was accused and found guilty of staring in a hostile way at someone on a date the investigator didn't know, but when he told me the subject matter that was being discussed, I was able to tell him the date, and he said that he thought that I'd done that. And I said, well, why didn't you ask the 9 witnesses? Oh no, I'm not going to ask those witnesses. There were 9 people present at the meeting, I said to him. Oh no, I'm not going to ask them. And I said, why not? And he said, well, it's so long ago they wouldn't remember. So in other words, and there's a serious point here, on the basis of the say-so of a complainant about something that was 10 years earlier, that wasn't even words spoken, but a facial expression, I was found guilty of bullying. Esther, Philip, I honestly think that if fair-minded people out there are watching this interview, they would think, what? That's not real. That doesn't sound right. And I don't know myself of any workplace in the country, or indeed in the democratic world, where such a policy exists. And that policy of looking at things that did or didn't happen, that were or weren't said 8, 10, 12 years ago, has since been scrapped. And in fact, wait for it, it was scrapped immediately after my case was concluded. So now people have to bring complaints within 12 months. I was judged on the basis of people's recollections of what happened 10 and 12 years ago. And it was all done under parliamentary privilege, so that I couldn't challenge it in court. I wasn't allowed to see communications between decision makers and staff within the House. I wasn't allowed to see any of that. I wasn't allowed to cross-examine people, etc. So I said that it was a kangaroo court, and I would only qualify that statement by saying to say it was a kangaroo court is intensely insulting to kangaroos.